Let's just now focus our attention to food manufacturing, largest manufacturing sector in Canada, largest employer in the manufacturing sector in Canada. So I think I've always said, strong, robust, healthy food and beverage manufacturing sector is good for the entire supply chain. So Christian, I mean, 2025, I'm thinking of tariffs being a major news story, and thinking as well as like consumers have dealt with quite a bit of food inflation. I mean, they're still dealing with significant food inflation. And we always say, well, we're lucky enough that we're in a sector for which consumers are not responding to price changes, right? You have to feed the idea that you have to feed yourself, basically, no matter what. But at the end of the day, consumers can make different choices when it comes to the type of products they're going to purchase, across the different products, within the product, but different quality. So what was the year like in 2025? What are the factors that you think played out in 2025 that can have an impact in 2026 as well?
Yeah, so a year ago when we presented our 2025 outlook, we were somewhat concerned, right, about tariffs and household spending for the reasons you mentioned, right? So turns out that our concerns were warranted, right? So 2025 looks like an okay year in terms of nominal sales, but when you remove the effect of prices and only look at volumes, then the picture is not all that great. So volumes were actually down for a third consecutive year in 2025. And nobody really should be surprised here because manufacturers face really difficult circumstances, the most visible being tariffs. So it's true that most food and beverage products entered the US tariff-free thanks to CUSMA, but then even then, like you saw export volumes fall right sharply in 2025. So that highlights that there are still obstacles to move products across the border. So, for example, additional costs to make sure that the goods are CUSMA compliant. And also, we know China also imposed tariffs on some Canadian goods, which impacted our exports. So performance varied across subsectors. I won't go over each and every subsector, or else we'll be here the whole day. But what I can do is give you a high-level overview by showing you the next chart. I think that tells that tells a story because it gives what happened to sales in some industries. And here the blue bar basically shows nominal sales, and the green bar shows volumes, right? While the numbers inside the bars refer to the annual growth rate. And as you can tell, right, the impact of China's tariffs are visible, right, in grain and oilseed milling, and also seafood. So tariffs on oilseeds were like really hit hard, right? Given that oilseed, processing accounts for about 85% of that subsector's sales. Tariffs on pork and aquatic products were smaller, but still notable, right? So those reduced exports. On a positive note, meat processors enjoyed higher sales, right? But we know that's entirely because of higher prices. Also registering higher sales last year compared to 2024 were processors of dairy products and a couple of others like sugar and confectionery, for example. Looking ahead to 2026, unfortunately, some of those factors that impacted sales last year, I think, are still present, and are therefore expected to influence sales this year as well, JP.
Thinking of next year, right? So Kuzma will likely be a major influence. I mean, I think we have, more than 97% of the actual Canadian food export that are exempt of tariffs. So obviously we need Kuzma to still be in play, still facilitate the trade between the the two countries. But what do we anticipate, maybe thinking of domestically consumer here, like what is the outlook for consumers in 2026?
So yeah, so I gave you right at the beginning when we talked macro, I was basically telling you we're not that optimistic about consumers as a whole, right? Consumption spending as a whole. But and I get the reasons why. But when it comes to consumer spending on food, that's a staple, right? And it's not a discretionary item. So that's why we're a bit more positive on this one, right? So we think, actually the next chart is going to, help you understand why we're more optimistic here. And it shows, the per capita expenditures on food and beverage are finally stabilizing, right? So you saw them decline, like per capita expenditure falling in 2023 and 2024. Basically, and now it's stabilizing, right? And if you look at the first 3 quarters of 2025 compared to 2024, Canadians bought more food, right? I think last I checked, it was around 1.2% higher compared to the same period, the first 3 quarters of 2024. So that's for us we look at this and say, you know what, that's a good base from which sales can grow from, right? There's one caveat though, right? And so here we're assuming exports of food, you know, for manufacturers, we're expecting exports of food and beverage products won't get any worse, right? So we acknowledge there's downside risk for some processes in terms of sales and revenues, but overall optimistic for sales. On the cost side, we're expecting a moderation, so much in line with our view that there will be a stabilization and or even falling input prices, right? So you think of cattle, canola, cocoa, aluminum. Those are just examples where, you know, prices are expected to retreat slightly in 2025 after, you know, from 2025 after last year we hit record highs. So that should provide some relief to processors that use those things as inputs, right? So in addition to those raw materials, I'll say a softer jobs market is also something that will provide some relief in terms of wage growth for processors. So there are lower growth in wage costs for those processors. So that should help, the moderation should help lower input costs as a whole. So all in all, you can tell from this chart here is that we're expecting cost of production to moderate this year. So we don't want to be complacent here, right? So I'll say it's unlikely to be a smooth adjustment because there are still uncertainties out there, right? So like very complex economic environment with cost influenced by uncertainties, including trade policy. So bottom line here is that margins in the food and beverage manufacturing, in our view, should improve in 2026 with those caveats, right? But all in all, if we're right about margins improving, then that would provide a good base for businesses to restart investment again, right? So perhaps later this year or even in 2027 as trade-related uncertainties start to dissipate.
Yeah, and this is actually good news if we do see the cost of goods sold and cost of production kind of come down a little bit. But then there is just also what all the other things that food processors have to deal with in terms of additional costs to make sure that they meet different requirements, regulations, and so forth. That's a different story. But I think there's some pressure still, but a little bit of upside, which on margins, which is a positive. So thanks for this, Christian.